To outline today's event, the webinar in its entirety will run approximately 1.5 hours, which includes a Q&A session. And if you have questions now or during the webinar, please enter those questions into the Q&A chat pod. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Our speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Eric Brodsky, MD, Associate Director, Labeling Policy Team, Office of New Drug Policy, Office of New Drugs, CDER. Please join me in welcoming our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Brodsky.
Thank you for the kind introduction. As stated, I'm Eric Brodsky, and I'm from the Labeling Policy Team in the Office of New Drugs at the Center for Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Today's webinar is about our updated, redesigned, reorganized labeling resources for human prescription drugs. Welcome to the webinar. Here's my disclaimer. There are many learning objectives. During this webinar, I'll provide an overview of FDA's labeling resources for human prescription drugs. That's our home page for labeling resources. I'll also talk about the difference between what we call current labeling or in-use labeling and the last FDA-approved labeling. What I mean by current labeling for the purposes of this presentation is labeling that is submitted to the FDA electronically after approval of an application or supplement. We'll also discuss searchable labeling databases like DailyMed, FDA Label, Drugs at FDA, the Medication Guide, searches, and also searchable product databases. What do I mean by this? Biosimilar products, CDER's novel drugs, these are new molecular entities and new biological products, EUAs, NDC directory, Orange Book, Purple Book, drug safety communications. We'll also locate specific prescribing information resources on the Prescribing Information Resources webpage, included a new updated prescribing information template. And the majority of this discussion today will be about the Prescribing Information Resources webpage. So additional resources includes our Patient Labeling Resources webpage, which includes instructions for use, medication guides, and patient package inserts. Additionally, we have a carton container labeling resources webpage. We have two web pages for specific product categories, including generic drug labeling and specific considerations for biological product labeling, such as non-proprietary naming and biosimilar interchangeable products. Finally, our last resource primarily for industry, this is specifically for structured product labeling developers. This resource is to help select appropriate codes when they're reviewing and developing structured product labeling prior to submission. As we all know, structured product labeling is the standard that FDA accepts for electronic labeling, and it's used downstream by hospitals, healthcare practitioners, healthcare information systems, academia. So before we talk about the new web pages, let's talk about what we had before. Before we had the Prescription Drug Labeling Resources web page, it was a very lengthy page with over 150 labeling resources. And some of the resources were for different audiences, including healthcare practitioners and industry. Some of them had different product type information. For example, the prescribing information for healthcare practitioners and patient labeling for patients and caregivers. And there was a mixture of information for specific product categories such as generic drug labeling and biological product labeling. Generally, it was difficult for users to find information they were looking for. So what did we do? We reorganized, reformatted the single web page into 8 different web pages. One, we have 7 web pages for industry, including 1 specific page for structured product labeling developers. And we have 1 page for healthcare practitioners and patients. Last month, we did a talk about this web page entitled Frequently Asked Questions About Labeling for Prescription Medicines, and you could see the presentation and the link in the footnote. So generally for these web pages, we added organizational elements like accordions. So accordions allows you to see the big picture and subsequently toggle to the detailed information that's hidden when you look at the big picture. We added descriptions of resources. But so before you click, you could see what the resource is about. Generally, we organized information according to alphabetical order so you could find it. And on each of the subsequent slides, I'll highlight some notable resources for each of the 7 industry web pages. Now, this is the first web page, FDA's Labeling Resources for Human Prescription Drugs. This is our home web page. This is what the home page looks like, FDA's Labeling Resources for Human Prescription Drugs. At the bottom of the page, you could see the information in rows. These are the accordions I was talking about previously. If you click on anywhere in that entire row called Searchable Labeling Databases, more information appears. You click on it again, that information is hidden. Additionally, on the page, on the left side, you can toggle to other pages. Let's say you want to go to the Patient Labeling Resources page. You go to the left and you click that, and then you're on the Patient Labeling Resources page. Additionally, you could scroll to the bottom of the main page and you could click on these links and get to the other pages as well. Additionally, this home page points you to other resources that the FDA has. For example, we have promotional labeling resources, which are in other pages. If you want labeling information about specific FDA-regulated products like non-prescription drugs, like the drug facts labeling, medical devices, medical device labeling, you have links there. If you want to see the animal drugs at FDA, which is similar to drugs at FDA, you could click on animal drugs. Additionally, you could see additional information about homeopathic products, dietary supplements, cosmetics, and tobacco. We also have information about food labeling, over-the-counter food labeling. So how may current labeling be different than FDA-approved labeling? So we discussed that current labeling, also referred to in-use labeling, is the labeling submitted by companies electronically to FDA's electronic system, and that is subsequently distributed to other websites like DailyMed and FDA Label. So current labeling may be the same as FDA-approved labeling, but there may be some differences. Differences may include minor changes that appear in an annual report, something called an annual reportable change. These may be minor editorial changes. It could also be a change in the distributor's name and or address. Moderate changes are also maybe a difference. These are called changes being affected labeling supplements, or CBE labeling supplements. So the applicant submits one of these supplements. The labeling is uploaded to FDA's electronic database and then distributed, for example, DailyMed, FDA Label. During this time, FDA is still reviewing the proposed changes. FDA may approve those changes exactly what the applicant proposed, or there may be some differences. Generally, CBE labeling supplement changes are safety related, so it may be to add an adverse reaction in the post-marketing experience subsection of the adverse reaction, or potentially propose a new warnings and precautions section. So searchable labeling databases. On the left, you can see a detailed description about all these databases. In subsequent slides, I'll compare the differences and similarities between DailyMed, FDA label, and drugs at FDA. So this is FDA label, and this is a web-based application that allows you to search up to 140,000, that's 140,000 structured product labeling files. The scope is pretty broad of FDA-regulated products, including human prescription drugs and non-prescription drugs, animal prescription drugs, animal over-the-counter drugs, cosmetics, dietary supplements, medical devices, medical foods. It's different than DailyMed in two ways. Number one, some searching functions as well as appearance, and we'll explain that in subsequent slides. FDA label allows you to do multiple searches, for example, of labeling types, application types or marketing categories. You could look for labeling text within the entire prescription drug labeling, including the prescribing information, FDA-approved patient labeling, and a representative sample of carton container labeling. Or you could look for text within a section or subsection of the prescribing information. For example, let's say one is interested in finding other labeling that have a box warning for hepatotoxicity. You could specifically search for that in FDA label. So what are the differences between these databases? So drugs at FDA, most importantly, has FDA-approved labeling, generally as the last approved labeling by the FDA. This is certainly true for NDAs and BLAs. DailyMed has current labeling submitted by firms, same as FDA label. The format is PDF for drugs at FDA, structured product labeling format for both DailyMed and FDA label. So what's the scope? What products are included? All three databases include CDER-approved prescription and non-prescription human drugs and biological products. These are under NDAs and BLAs. Drugs at FDA rarely has generic drug labeling approved under ANDAs. However, DailyMed and FDA label typically has generic drug labeling. I should say that DailyMed and FDA label may not have labeling if the product is not being marketed. Drugs at FDA is for CDER approved products. CDER has its own system, and we have a link to CDER's system to find CDER approved drugs and biological products such as vaccines, allergenics, plasma, blood and blood products, cellular and tissue therapy, gene therapy products. So that's not on drugs at FDA, but that's on DailyMed and FDA label. Unapproved human drugs such as homeopathics are not on drugs at FDA. They're not approved. However, they generally appear on DailyMed and FDA label. So what information is included on these three databases? So most importantly, drugs at FDA has the scientific reviews, so the rationale for the safety and effectiveness determination. Critical reviews, multidisciplinary approach. It also has communications with applicants, end of phase 2 meetings, pre-BLA, pre-NDA meeting minutes, drug development communications. It has historical labeling. It also has the last approved labeling. Now, DailyMed and FDA label do not have the scientific reviews. Daily Med does have some archived old labeling. Carton container labeling may appear on drugs FDA, especially on approval of the original NDA or BLA. However, subsequently, drugs at FDA generally does not have carton and container labeling. However, a representative sample of carton container labeling must appear in structured product labeling files, and thus they do appear on Daily Med and FDA label. Repackager relabeling, that represents up to 50% of prescription labeling and distribution, a pretty large number. And we also have a significant amount of authorized generic labeling. That will not appear on drugs at FDA because generally those labeling are not approved. However, they will appear on Daily Med and FDA label. Now, search functions. You can search using all three databases by application number or drug name. You could also search by drug class, NDC number, active or inactive ingredient using Daily Med or FDA label. Drugs at FDA does not allow that, does not have that search capability. You can search by labeling section. We talked about that earlier on Daily Med and FDA label. The blue are some additional features with FDA label that doesn't appear on Daily Med, such by searching regulatory type of searches, like searching by application type, ANDA, BLA, NDA, also DEA schedule and or marketing status. You could also export your results to an Excel spreadsheet. The searchable product databases, I'll take a moment and pause, and I'll allow you to look at this long list. So essentially, the website explains the contents of each of these databases. For example, I'm going to show you the CDER novel drugs and biological products database. So this is a database, and I'll show you on the next slide, that has been in existence since 2011, so over 11 years. So this is where we report out CDER's new molecular entities and new biological products, including a link to their labeling. Now moving on to web page 2, prescribing information resources. This is the bulk of the presentation. This is the appearance of the prescribing information resources webpage. And you can find the link below. So this is the prescribing information resources webpage. Take a look at the content at the beginning of the webpage. I'll pause. I want to highlight the prescribing information guidances and maps. Under this accordion, you can basically search for any FDA published guidance or published map. What we did with this web page is included the relevant guidances and maps under the specific section or subsection of the prescribing information, the full prescribing information, or under the highlights of prescribing information. So instead of listing all the prescribing information guidances and or maps here, we listed them below, and we'll go through that. Now I want to point out to you several of the resources on the prescribing information page. So first of all, I should say congratulations to everyone. We have finished the required PLR conversions. So as we know, in 2006, the physician labeling rule was published. It was implemented in 2009. In over a decade, we finished all the required PLR conversions. So those NDAs and BLAs that were required to have PLR format, physician labeling format, have PLR format. So now we're working on voluntary PLR conversions. So we've stated in several settings, in rules, in Federal Register notices, in guidances, that PLR format represents a more useful approach for communicating accurate and up-to-date information. We also strongly encourage all applicants to voluntarily PLR convert. So what we usually tell divisions and applicants is trying to concentrate on those drugs that are being used a lot, and two, if there are potential safety issues. What do I mean by that? Well, have there been medication error reports that potentially can be approved by labeling? Are these drugs listed on the list of drugs that if there was a medication error, then there would be a high risk for harm, such as certain anti-diabetics like insulins, anticoagulants, chemotherapy, parental nutrition products. So we highly encourage folks to PLR convert their labeling as appropriate on a voluntary basis. And we have approved over 300 voluntary PLR conversions. So how to PLR convert? So Dr. Sarabi on the labeling policy team did a fantastic presentation, and basically he talked about some of the general considerations when converting, and also some of the specific considerations, such as some of the regulations are different in old format labeling, or non-PLR format labeling, and PLR format labeling, like contraindication. And the threshold for a contraindication is much higher in PLR format compared to old format. So it is possible when you PLR convert, you may remove a contraindication because there's a different definition. And that contraindication, that contraindicated use may go to the warnings and precautions section. So there are a lot of tidbits about how to convert labeling from old format to PLR format in this presentation. So what's new? One of the things we did is we updated the prescribing information template. This template is located under the Format Tools and Samples template heading, and you can consider this when developing PLR for a new molecular entity, a new biological product, but you could also consider this when submitting in your next labeling supplement for an already approved product in PLR format. So what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes when we review labeling, we see items that are missing, or inadvertently missing. For example, sometimes we'll see a warning precaution and there's no description of the clinically significant adverse reaction or risk. Essentially, the warning precaution will provide directives, risk mitigation strategies about prevention, management of the clinically significant adverse reaction or risk, but it won't describe the risk or adverse reaction. So that's one thing to do. Consider the template has some of those concepts. I should note it doesn't have everything. It doesn't have all the regulatory requirements or all the guidance recommendations, but it's a decent start for your consideration. This is the begin. So the template has a sample highlights, table of contents, and full prescribing information. What you're looking at here is the beginning of the full prescribing information. And this page contains required and recommended information in the box warning, indications and usage section, and also certain information in the dosage and administration section. Now I'm turning further in the template. Here are some items in the clinical studies section of labeling. And I do want to point out one thing, baseline demographics. So we looked at baseline demographics for all NMEs and new biological products approved in the last 2.5 years. And we're doing great with respect to age and biological sex reporting. Not as well on racial groups and ethnic groups. In those labeling, about 120 labeling, as I recall. About 75% of labeling reported complete information about the racial subgroups in the studies, in the labeling. And only 25% reported ethnic subgroup information in the labeling. What do I mean by ethnic subgroups? Hispanic or Latino versus not Hispanic or Latino. So this is a good reminder, potentially using the template. Oh, wow, I forgot about this. This is something I want to include in our labeling. Further on in the template, as you know, manufacturing information is required in prescription drug labeling. It is typically included at the end of the prescribing information after the patient counseling information section. And it's pretty complicated. There are certain required statements. As you know, if you want to name the packer, there's actually two phrases that one must use. You could choose between two phrases. There's a slightly more flexibility with the distributor. You could pick up to, it looks like 4 or 5 phrases, and there's even more flexibility about phrases for the manufacturer. There's different, quote, manufacturer information that's required for NDAs and BLAs, such as the license number is required for BLAs. It's not required for NDAs. So this is another presentation that appears under the General Labeling Presentations heading on the Prescribing Information Resources webpage. So this is a presentation that I did about a year ago where I talked about 4 recent guidances that were just published, were recently published. And the guidances describe how to include pediatric information in labeling, geriatric information in labeling, immunogenicity information in labeling, and abuse, misuse, addiction, physical dependence, and tolerance information in labeling, primarily for that concept, the drug abuse and dependence section of labeling. Additionally, under the General Labeling Presentations heading, we have a presentation done in 2017 about consistency of labeling information. And some of the examples in this presentation is that we've seen sometimes labeling that's internally inconsistent, almost like 2 different people wrote different parts of the labeling. Group 1 wrote the clinical pharmacology section, Group 2 wrote the use in specific population section, and maybe Group 3 wrote the dosage administration section. And very important to have a consistent information throughout the labeling. Sometimes we've seen labeling where it's not clear if the drug's actually approved in pediatric patients. There's an inconsistency between information in section 1 and subsection 8.4. Sometimes it's not clear what age groups is approved. So this presentation discusses those concepts. So like I was telling you before, we changed how the information is presented on these web pages. So the second set of accordions on the Prescribing Information Resources webpage is organized according to the prescribing information. So we have the highlights of prescribing information, and under that accordion has all relevant rules, regulations, guidances, related guidances, and presentations related to the highlights of prescribing information. Then we have the box warning. Then we have sections 1 through 17. And here is sections 8 through 11. Notice we have specific content on required subsections 8.1 through 8.5. Continuing on, here is sections 12 through 17. Similarly, we have information on required subsections 12.1, 12.2, and 12.3, and recommended as appropriate subsections, microbiology, pharmacogenomics, and immunogenicity. So under the highlights of prescribing information heading, we have this resource. So these are product titles, approved product titles that appear in the highlights of prescribing information of approved drugs. And these product titles are consistent with the requirements in the product title regulation, as well as the recommendations in the draft product title and initial use approval guidance. Now, the product title may be pretty easy if the dosage form is tablets or capsules, but some dosage forms can be pretty complicated. For example, for extended release injectable suspension. So this document may help you develop the product title. We also have examples when products do not have proprietary names. They only have a non-proprietary name. So how you develop the product title for such products. Additionally, under the highlights of prescribing information heading on the web page prescribing information resources, we have the established pharmacological class resource. So as we know, EPCs, so the EPC text phrase goes in the indications and usage heading in the highlights of prescribing information. Such like drug X is a, you insert the EPC text phrase indicated for. So EPCs, they're a group of active moieties and they share scientific properties that are clinically meaningful. And one key issue is that the EPC is tied to an indication. Sometimes a product a labeling has two or more EPCs because the indications are different. And again, the EPC is tied to the indication. If you click on one indications and usage, this pops up. Again, we try to highlight first our FR notices and then rules. If we have no such specific information regarding that, we have a guidance, and then we have related guidances, and then we have presentations. So if you're developing the indications and usage section of labeling, this may be one good source to look at. Under 2, dosage administration heading, I'm happy to report about 2 weeks ago, we published the revised draft dosage administration section of labeling. This replaces the March 2010 guidance. This guidance talks about the required and recommended information for this section of labeling, which includes the required and recommended dosage, preparation, and administration instructions. One key concept of this section, really important, is that we try to remove extra stuff that doesn't belong in the DNA section. So information that's not directly related to the dosage, preparation, administration of the drug, or storage of the prepared product should not ordinarily be in Section 2. However, it may be required or recommended in other sections of labeling. We will have training on this guidance in the spring. Please, if you have comments, submit it by March 14, 2023, although we generally look at your comments after the recommended time to make comments. So under 6 adverse reactions heading on the Prescribing Information Resources webpage, we have a new presentation that we uploaded. This was done at a Duke Margolis conference where we talked about FDA medical queries, or FMQs. Essentially, the merits of grouping terms, multiple merits for grouping terms. You potentially may pick up a signal that was not initially apparent when there were events that were spread across many individual terms. You may provide a better estimate of the true magnitude of the adverse reaction, and sometimes you may exclude an untoward event that's not related or unlikely related. So there are benefits of grouping terms. And so this discussion there are some considerations for how to include such terminology, group terminology, as well as their component terminology in the common adverse reaction table in the adverse reaction section. So including information in the body of the table as well as the footnotes. Under the pediatric use 8.4, we have our presentation about how to include pediatric information all throughout the labeling. And we have 4 scenarios that's discussed in the pediatric labeling guidance. Scenario 1 is that the evidence supports the safety and effectiveness of a drug for a pediatric indication. And scenarios 2, 3, and 4 are situations where evidence does not support the safety and effectiveness of a drug for a pediatric indication and how one would label that drug. Under 8.5, geriatric use, you can see we first include the geriatric labeling rule, which was published in 1997, implemented in 1998, as well as the geriatric labeling guidance, the presentation we did in 2020. One of the key features of this guidance is to, well, first of all, it's an analysis of the differences in safety and effectiveness between geriatric patients and younger adult patients. Sometimes we see a difference with respect to safety and effectiveness. So sometimes there's no differences in response, no differences in effectiveness between geriatric patients and younger adult patients. However, there's a difference in safety. So in those 2 situations, you may include the required regulatory statement or the alternative regulatory statement, if accurate and appropriate, about effectiveness, and you may describe the safety data. So sometimes safety and effectiveness are different with respect to comparing it in geriatric patients and younger adult patients. Moving down further on the page, we talked a lot about clinical information in the prescribing information. There's also important clinical pharmacology information in the prescribing information, and I'm highlighting the mechanism of action, pharmacodynamics, and pharmacokinetic subsections, subsections 12.1 to 12.3. Here's the main guidance and related guidance related to that section. There's also multiple presentations we've done throughout the years about some requirements, recommendations, and some considerations about including clinical pharmacology information into Section 12, the clinical pharmacology section of labeling. Also, in addition to clinical pharmacology, we have product quality information. For example, under 16, how supplied, storage, and handling, we have multiple related guidances. Now, we don't have a specific guidance, Section 16 guidance. We don't have that, but we do have some related guidances that provide recommendations for this section of labeling. Additionally, we have done several presentations on product quality information and labeling, including how to include information in Section 16. For example, we did a presentation about 5 years ago about some, first of all, requirements, recommendations, and some considerations for including product quality information throughout the prescribing information. And in this presentation, we take 6 different parts of the prescribing information. 2 parts in the highlights of prescribing information, the product title and the dosage forms and strengths heading in highlights. 3 parts of the body of the full prescribing information, sections 3, 11, and 16, dosage forms and strengths, description, and how supplied, storage, and handling sections, as well as the manufacturing information at the end of the prescribing information. Web page 3, patient labeling resources. This is how the page appears. You could click on the links on the page and get to information about instructions for use, medication guides, and patient package inserts. We have a picture of instructions for use, medication guide, as well as a patient package insert. This guidance was published as final in July 2022. It's a very important guidance. As you know, instructions for use are for those products that have complicated or detailed patient use instructions. And they typically, they're written for the patient, which is at or below the national reading level, which is about the reading level of a sixth grader. And it provides step-by-step written and visual instructions about how to prepare the product, administer it, handle it, store, and dispose of the drug. Importantly, that some of the decisions about developing instructions for use, that they're made very early in development when you're preparing, when you're writing your protocol for your human factors study. This is a guidance that consider consulting, because it's important that the human factor studies, which typically include instructions for use, have some of these concepts. So think about this guidance very early in development before conducting the human factors studies. So here's a picture of the instructions for use. Here's a picture of the medication guide. We also on the website refer people to the medication guide regulations, and as well as the requirements to have a medication guide, the conditions where one would have a medication guide. Here's a picture of the PPI, also called patient package insert or patient information. Note that oral contraceptives and estrogen-containing products are required to have PPIs. There are many other products that have PPIs. If you're an oral contraceptive or estrogen-containing product, there's certain required format and content. However, for all other PPIs, we recommend a similar format to the medication guide format, so patients who see this see a similar information. One either has patient information or a medication guide. One does not have both. So web page 4, turning our attention to carton and container labeling resources. You can click on many items, including statutory regulatory requirements of carton and container labeling, guidances and maps, and other resources for the carton and container labeling. Here is a picture of a container label. This is a very important guidance that was published last May, and this is safety considerations for carton labels and carton labeling designed to minimize medication errors. So this guidance talks about critical information that should appear on the principal display panel. The principal display panel is the part of the container or carton that is likely to be shown to the user. The user could be the patient, consumer, the pharmacist, or the healthcare practitioner, the physician, nurse practitioner. The guidance talks about avoiding error-prone abbreviations and symbols, talks about recommendations for standardizing how to express expiration dates. Then there's specific considerations for different types of product designs, like blister packs, large volume parentals, pharmacy bulk packages, and insulin auto-injectors. It's a fantastically written guidance. Additionally, on this page, we talk about improving consistency of information as appropriate across all labeling And specifically here, the prescribing information in carton container labeling. Occasionally and inadvertently, we've seen inappropriate differences in dosage form, package type terms, recommended dosage, cautionary or warning statements. Sometimes, actually at the FDA, there are different people that generally review the carton container labeling than the prescribing information. We have specific folks called Associate Directors for Labeling in the Prescription Drug Review Divisions that try to ensure consistency of information across prescription drug labeling. So very important, not only is important to have consistency as appropriate within a labeling document, like the prescribing information, but it's also important to have consistency across different types of labeling documents, like the prescribing information and the carton and container labeling. Moving on to web page number 5, specific considerations, specific resources for generic drugs. So here is a picture of the page, generic drug labeling. This page includes an overview of generic drug labeling, the responsibilities of ANDA holders, abbreviated new drug application holders, or generic drug companies to update their labeling, as well as requirements, statutory requirements, guidances for generic drugs. First of all, how can a generic drug labeling be different or similar to its reference listed drug labeling or RLD labeling, the NDA labeling? So generic drug labeling must meet the same as standard. So the generic drug labeling must be the same as the reference listed drug labeling, except for a few permissible differences. Differences due to inactive ingredients, package size differences, differences due to patents and or exclusivity. So if there's existing exclusivity for the RLD, for example, the RLD has a new approved indication, a new approved dosing regimen, that may be protected by patents and exclusivity, and the generic drug labeling will not have that information. Also, rarely, there may be differences due to an approved suitability petition. So, for example, the reference drug labeling, RLD labeling, may have a dosage form of tablets, but the petition may allow the generic drug to market it with capsules. But again, suitability petitions are relatively uncommon. So we asked the ANDA holder, the generic drug labeling company, to routinely review labeling for the reference listed drug, the RLD, specifically approved labeling on drugs at FDA. Constantly labeling is updated. The reference drug labeling is updated. If it's updated, it appears on drugs at FDA. Then we ask the ANDA holder to promptly update their generic drug labeling to be consistent and meet the same as standard requirements as the RLD labeling. Now, besides drugs at FDA, ANDA holders have different other ways to follow the RLD labeling changes. One, they could subscribe to CDER drug safety labeling changes and get an alert, or they can request the labeling at FDA's Division of Freedom of Information department, either online, fax, or mail request. Page 6, we're moving on to biological products specific labeling resources. Here's a picture of the page. This web page has biological products has specific considerations. This web page includes specific guidances on the non-proprietary nomenclature, the proper name for biological products. It has guidances on developing biosimilar labeling, as well as developing biosimilar interchangeable labeling. I should say that I'm glad to say that we've approved 40 biosimilar products, of which 4 are interchangeable biosimilars, which is pretty amazing. The first year, in 2015, we approved 1 biosimilar product, and now 2023, we have 40 biosimilar products, 4 of which are interchangeable. And I believe they're for 11 different reference products. In addition to non-proprietary name information, as well as biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilar labeling information, we have information about the 95 or so products that were deemed BLAs and the recommendations for those products to update their labeling. The last page is selection of appropriate SPL codes for human prescription drug labeling, and this is specifically for structured product labeling, or SPL, developers. Now you may say, well, why am I talking about this? Well, structured product labeling or electronic labeling that the FDA accepts is really important. As I mentioned earlier, this is how labeling frequently is distributed. That's the labeling for Daily Med. Some companies use structured product labeling to present their labeling. FDA label has it. Sometimes we've seen issues with structured product labeling in terms of how this information is coded. So Dr. Sarabi, in this excellent presentation, talks about the importance of coding structured product labeling submissions. If structured product labeling submissions are not coded properly, potentially you can miss that section when you're doing searching functions. So very important to code information correctly and accurately. To that end, what we did is create a document that links up the LOINC code and the LOINC name. So LOINC is Logical Observation Identifiers, Names, and Codes, essentially an SPL code with the section and subsection name as per regulations or by guidance. This is to help SPL developers, again, develop their structured product labeling file. As we know, applicants are required to look at their structured product labeling submissions at least every June and December of every year. The structured product labeling submission, their listing submission, includes labeling. So we recommend that you at least twice a year to look at your structured product labeling submission, see if it's accurate, see if it's up to date. Generally, we recommend within 14 days after approval of an NDA BLA or a BLA supplement or an NDA supplement, you submit your new updated structured product labeling file to FDA's electronic system. So challenge questions. What I'm going to do for these challenge questions, I'm going to read the question and I'll let you pick the answer. So for this one, the last FDA approved labeling and current labeling, which is labeling most recently submitted by applicants to FDA's electronic system. This is after approval. Choose the best and most accurate answer. So the correct answer is D. So current labeling and approved labeling may differ due to some minor changes. For example, changing the name and address of the distributor. It may also differ due to moderate labeling changes submitted through a CDE labeling supplement. And such changes typically are safety related, like adding an adverse reaction, adding or modifying a warning and precaution. If there is a major labeling change, like adding a new dosage regimen, adding a new indication, adding new clinical studies, that information is submitted in a prior approval labeling supplement, and that must be approved prior to distribution. FDA-approved labeling appears on drugs at FDA. It generally does not appear on FDA label or Daily Med. FDA label and Daily Med has current labeling. So challenge question number 2, FDA's labeling resources for human prescription drugs. The web pages contain the following resources. You could select more than one. Hint, it's going to be more than one. Great, it's actually all of them. So examples of product titles and examples of established pharmacological class phrases that appear in the highlights of prescribing information, that's under the highlights and prescribing information tab on the prescribing information resources webpage. There's a specific dedicated page to generic drug labeling, and there's also a specific dedicated page to biological product labeling. Searchable labeling databases like Medication Guide, Search, Pediatric Labeling, Drugs at FDA appears on the main home page, FDA's labeling resources for human prescription drugs. Challenge question number 3. The sample prescribing information template that appears on the prescribing information resources webpage. This one, select only one answer. Answer B is correct. It may be used to develop labeling for an upcoming labeling supplement submission. It does not contain all the required elements, doesn't contain all the regulations. There is no requirement to use this template. This is an optional template for you to use. So closing thoughts, FDA is dedicated to providing, maintaining, and updating labeling resources for human prescription drugs so that prescription drug labeling has a summary of the essential scientific information needed to use these drugs safely and effectively, and so that healthcare practitioners, patients, as well as caregivers for patients have accurate, up-to-date, useful, well-written information about prescription drugs. Thank you. At the end of the presentation, at the end of the slides, I should say, I highlighted all of the guidances related to labeling that have been published in the last year and labeling guidances that we're working on to publish as draft and to finalize. Thank you. And the next part of this webinar will be the question and answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Brodsky, for that great presentation. We'll now transition into our Q&A session. As a reminder, if you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Looks like we have some questions coming in right now, and here is the first question for Dr. Brodsky. Regarding the 2023 dosage and administration guidance, what has changed from the prior 2010 version?
Great question, Ray, to start out with. So first of all, the 2023 guidance that we published about a week and a half ago is about 32 pages long. The 2010 guidance, 13 years ago, is about 9 pages long. Over the last 13 years, we've published many labeling guidances that have recommendations about how to dose, prepare, administer the drug. For example, the pediatric labeling guidance talks about recommendations for dosing in pediatric patients. The geriatric labeling guidance talks about recommendations for dosing in geriatric patients. The drug abuse and dependence section of labeling guidance discusses about how to potentially taper a drug associated with withdrawal syndrome after abrupt discontinuation, such as an SSRI or a beta blocker or a benzodiazepine. So there's been a tremendous amount of information and other guidances. Thus, we felt the need to update it. As I stated earlier in the presentation, we're going to have training this spring. We're thinking about 2 sessions, given it's a very lengthy guidance. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have some more questions coming in, and here is the next question. What triggered the FDA to revise the one labeling webpage?
Good question, Ray. So as we talked about it in the first part of the presentation, we previously had a very lengthy page. It was over 150 labeling resources. We did something called a heat map to see where people were clicking on the page. And most people were clicking on the earlier resources. They weren't scrolling down to the bottom of the resources. I think so with that, we decided to change it to make it more user friendly. As I stated earlier, 7 pages for industry, including 1 page for structured product labeling developers, and it's according to subject matter, and also have a specific page that we developed more for healthcare practitioners and patients. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have more questions coming in. Here is the next question. Does labeling databases offer labeling for drugs for clinical research, and how often is FDA label updated?
FDA labels updated once weekly. The labeling resources drugs at FDA only includes approved labeling. It does not include labeling for investigational drugs. Similarly, drug Daily Med and FDA label only includes marketed labeling, so it does not include labeling for investigational drugs.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to the next question, we have the following. Is CBE available publicly when it is still under FDA's review? And does FDA set a goal for safety CBE approvals?
Good question. So CBE zero labeling supplements are the safety related supplements. We're required, if it's submitted under an NDA, to take an action within 6 months of submission. For BLAs, it's an internal goal date to take action within 6 months. We are working, generally we don't get many CBE zero labeling supplements. The last time I checked, we had 100. And the first question was, yes, that's correct, that CB0 labeling supplements are submitted by applicants. We post the labeling shortly after that on public web pages. FDA the labeling may be revised at the time of approval.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have more questions coming in. Here is the next question. Should pediatric PK data be included in the prescribing information?
Good question. So that depends upon the clinical scenario. So in the typical scenario, when a drug is approved for adults and pediatric patients, pediatric PK data is included in The pharmacokinetics subsection, specifically under the specific populations heading, because it's a subset of the entire approved population. If the drug is only approved in pediatric patients, it's not approved in adults. Pediatric PK data is included, actually, pediatric data information is included throughout the labeling. So, similarly, the major absorption, distribution, elimination data is from pediatric patients. So, that is in pediatric PK data is included under those headings rather than the specific populations heading in the pharmacokinetics subsection of the clinical pharmacology section. Now, in situations when a drug is only approved for adults, it's not approved in pediatric patients. Pediatric PK data generally is not included in the labeling in a quantitative way. There may be some situations if the drug is for a serious or life-threatening condition where we may include some qualitative statements in the pediatric use subsection, but it's very important not to imply or suggest a pediatric use if the drug is not approved in pediatric patients.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have more questions still coming in. And here's the next question. I would like to know when immunogenicity information is included in the label.
Good question. So we published a year ago, February 2022, the immunogenicity labeling guidance, and we also did a talk. Some more detailed information about this topic, you could go to the prescribing information labeling resources webpage, and under 12.6 immunogenicity, you can find the guidance as well as the presentation. But just generally, so the overwhelming majority of labeling do not include immunogenicity information. So if immunogenicity information is included in labeling for therapeutic biological products regulated in CDER and some select drug products that have immunogenicity assessments, such as heparins, oligonucleotides. So it's rather small in scope considering all the prescription products that the FDA regulates, prescription drugs and biological products, I should say. So the main concept in the immunogenicity labeling guidance is creation of a specific subsection, like a home section, home subsection for immunogenicity information. And that's subsection 12.6. That's in the clinical pharmacology section. And here in subsection 12.6, we include anti-drug antibody incidence, we include titer, neutralizing antibody data, as well as pharmacokinetic ADA effects. Now, if the product has clinically significant ADA, such as it affects safety, like hypersensitivity reactions, or potentially effectiveness, such information may be distributed or included in other sections of the prescribing, such as the adverse reaction section of labeling. This is particularly if you see a higher incidence of an adverse reaction, injection site reaction, infusion site reactions in patients who are ADA positive versus those that are ADA negative. One could also include information, relevant information in the warnings and precautions section, as well as the clinical study section. So one of the main concepts in this guidance is to distinguish between clinically significant ADA and those that are not clinically significant. Clinically significant are particularly those that have significant effects on effectiveness and or safety of the product. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have another question coming in right now, and here is the question. Do these web pages include information from drugs.com, WebMD, or RxList or other online resources?
No, the FDA, our web pages are concentrate on FDA labeling resources. The sites that you cited are third parties, not associated with the FDA. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. And here is our next question. We were recently asked to submit patient package inserts for two product types for which a PPI is not defined as required. Can we expect requests for PPIs to continue beyond the required product types?
Good question, Ray. So just to emphasize again, patient package inserts are required for two types of products, as the question stated. Those are oral contraceptives and estrogen containing products. I should note, as I stated earlier, we are revising the combined hormonal contraceptive labeling guidance, and it will include required and recommended um, content for CHCs or combined hormonal contraceptive PPIs. So back to the question. Uh, Although PPIs are only required for those two labeling types, sorry, two therapeutic areas that I mentioned, a specific labeling document may be required by the FDA if it's necessary for the safe and effective use of the drug. So, on our rules agenda, we've announced a future proposed rule which is called PMI, or Patient Medication Information. So, this would be a new type of FDA approved patient labeling, and it would be for certain products in the outpatient setting. I think going back to the question is really referring to consistency of the content of FDA-approved patient labeling. And I think we do have room for improvement, not just about the content of the FDA-approved labeling, but when we require um, um, FDA-approved patient labeling. So hopefully, the patient medication information rule, proposed rule, will come out soon, and hopefully we will finalize that and have a consistent FDA-approved patient labeling for drugs that are used on an outpatient basis. Thank you.
Thank you also for responding to that question. We have a few more questions coming in right now. We're taking a look at those, and here is the next question. Does the agency intend on creating a separate labeling resource for accelerated approval drugs?
So first of all, for the audience, so accelerated approval, it's one of the approaches we use to expedite drugs for serious or life-threatening conditions. We do have an accelerated approval labeling guidance, and if you go to the Prescription Drug Labeling Resources webpage, under indications and usage, you could find that final guidance that was published about 3 years ago. So back to the question, we actually do have an accelerated approval database, and it includes information about the drug. I should say that accelerated approval is not really tied to the drug. It's tied to the drug and the indication. So a drug may have 10 indications, and 9 of them are approved under traditional approval, and one indication is approved under accelerated approval. So it's the drug and the indication. And so the database includes information on whether the accelerated approval was converted to an accelerated approval to a traditional approval. But I think that the question relates to the Prescription Drug Labeling Resources web pages. That database does not appear on the web pages, on these web pages, but that's a good point. So what we'll do is we'll add that resource for people on the home page. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have a question on B2 drugs, and here is the question. What are the labeling requirements for a B2 drug?
Good question. So for the audience, uh, B2 applications or 505B applications, that's a type of new drug application where at least some of the information was not conducted by or for the applicant, and the applicant does not have a right of reference to use that information. So I think this is a common question that we receive from internally from the division. So a B2 labeling, it doesn't have to be identical to the listed drugs labeling. So the B2 labeling may be different It must meet all the labeling regulatory requirements, and it should be consistent with labeling guidances. Sometimes there's information in the listed drug labeling that does not or should not appear in the B2 labeling. So, for example, if the listed drug has two dosage forms, let's say one tablets and one's an oral solution for younger um, pediatric patients, low weight pediatric patients, but the B2 drug only includes a tablet dosage form, it may be impossible for that B2 to dose a pediatric patient. So potentially that B2 labeling will not include pediatric indications, at least for the younger pediatric patients, because you can't dose that patient, pediatric patients, with only the tablets for the B2 drug. So B2 labeling does not have to be identical. It's not the same standard as I talked about before. It's not the same standards of ANDA labeling. So generic drug labeling has the same as the RLD labeling standard, except for permissible differences. B2s do not have to be identical. Thank you for the question.
Moving on to our next question is the following. Does the FDA require the use of USP dosage form terms in labeling?
Good question. So this answer is different for drug products that are not biological products and biological products. So let's take the non-biological drug products. Again, these are drug products that are not biological products. So if there's an applicable USP monograph, the applicants must use the monograph title for the dosage form nomenclature. So if there is a monograph, one must use that dosage form in prescription drug labeling. So for that non-biological drug product, if there's not an applicable monograph, we generally recommend applicants look at some of the chapters in USP, particularly 1151. If it's not available there, one would consult USP nomenclature guidelines. Another good source is the product title and the initial use approval guidance that was published in 2018. There's an appendix, Appendix A, and that could be used for dosage form nomenclature well, that one is particularly for the product title, but more generally, you could use that dosage form nomenclature. Now, for biological products, it's different. We don't use USP monographs for biological products. But for biological products, similarly, we would use the general chapters in USP, such as 1151, the USP nomenclature guidelines, and also you could use that first appendix, Appendix A, in the product title guidance. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. And here is the next question. In which situation does the agency revise the label instead of the applicant?
Good question. So there are two types of items here. One is FDA can require an applicant to update their labeling under certain conditions. It's under FDA, safety labeling authorities. And that's if there's new safety information about a serious risk. That's one thing. So that's a requirement. More typically, um, FDA requests an applicant to update its labeling when potentially there's new information that does not meet that standard as I talked about. So there are two mechanisms for FDA to update labeling. I should say that when an applicant submits labeling, their draft labeling for a new drug application, a biologics license application, or a supplement to one of those applications, FDA takes a very active role about revising many parts of the labeling and works with the applicant on their labeling. And FDA, if FDA does not think the labeling contains a summary of the scientific information needed to use the drug safely and effectively, FDA will not approve that labeling. So there have been times that FDA will not approve an application or a supplement if FDA does not agree with the wording in the application. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question, Dr. Brodsky. We do have one regarding Daily Med, and it's the following. Can Daily Med for prescribing information be used for an ANDA submission? It's my understanding that the drugs at FDA is the site that should always be used.
The questioner is correct. So ANDA labeling must be the same as the last FDA approved labeling. FDA approved labeling appears on drugs at FDA. Daily Med the labeling on Daily Med may be different than FDA drugs at FDA because of the minor and moderate changes as discussed before. So yes, ANDA labeling should look to the last approved FDA labeling for the RLD on drugs at FDA.
Looks like we have just a couple minutes left. We're going to try to squeeze one more final question in before we move to closing. And here is the final question. How is an update to generic drug labeling initiated if the RLD is withdrawn?
Good question. So in 2020, at the end of 2020, Congress passed the modern legislation. And this is a mechanism where the FDA can work with ANDA holders to update their labeling when the associated reference listed drug has been withdrawn. Now, there are certain conditions. The reference listed drug could not have been withdrawn for reasons of safety and or effectiveness. There can't be any existing patents or exclusivity. So FDA has a mechanism to update ANDA labeling under modern when the reference listed drug has been withdrawn. And there's more information about modern under the generic labeling resources, that specific page. Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions. We want to thank Dr. Brodsky for answering numerous questions that came in and also for the very informative and timely talk. We do have a few closing reminders that we need to share. This activity is eligible for an attendance certificate which supports continuing education by SOCA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website at fde.gov/CDER SBIA for more details. You'll be able to obtain the attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. That means it closes on February the 9th. Please remember to download the certificate immediately upon completing the survey. It cannot be retrieved after the fact. Let us know your comments and feedback via the survey. This will help guide the design of our future events. Additional tutorials are available through fda.gov/CDER Learn. To summarize, for our physicians, pharmacists, and nurses claiming the 1.5 continuing education credits, attendees have 14 days from the last day of the activity to log in, complete the required CE evaluations, and attest to their attendance to claim credit. So be sure to complete the CE sessions evaluation on or before February the 9th. As a reminder, the email we send to attendees later today will have the information on both the CE claim code and the survey link. On behalf of CDER Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at fda.gov/CDER SBIA. Thank you for attending, and this concludes today's webinar.